I'd like us to think this morning about how do we react when things don't go as planned? Or how do we react when times get hard? What's our initial reaction to these things and ongoing reaction to things that don't go the way we want them to go when times get hard for us? I've entitled the lesson this morning, Words of Defeat or Words of Victory. And to begin with this morning, I'd like us to think about different situations we might face in life. Perhaps we might have economic concerns. I mean, if you watch the news at the moment, we hear a lot about cost of living worries that a lot of people in our community have. Maybe there are economic concerns about putting food on the table or putting enough fuel in your car to get to work. Maybe people are unemployed and have economic concerns in that fashion. Maybe others are worried by natural disasters, fires, floods, earthquakes. I know in the eastern states we've had several natural disasters that have caused people serious concern. Maybe there's war that people are caught up in. These are all of the economic type problems and concerns that people can have, and when things don't go the way we expect them or plan them to go, how do we react to that? Well, let's turn to the book of Job to begin with this morning, Job chapter 1, because Job, of course, faced such concerns, in particular these economic type concerns. Job chapter 1. And if we read in Job chapter 1 from verse 14, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were ploughing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans attacked and took them. They also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another also came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, another also came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." There Job was facing severe economic concerns, wasn't he? He had the raiding Sabaeans and the Chaldeans taking his livestock and killing his servants. And also we read about the fire of God fell from heaven. So he certainly had serious economic concerns. So in our lesson this morning, how do we react when we have economic concerns, things that don't go for us the way that we hope they might? But not only economic concerns, what about also family concerns? There might be ill health in the family, or we might have relatives who are lost or have fallen away from Christ, or there might even be the death of a loved one. How do we act? How do we react when things don't go as expected, as planned? Well, again, while we're in Job, of course, Job faced that very problem as well. Let's go down to Job chapter 1, verse 18. Back in verse 2, of course, you'll remember that Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters. They were grown-up children. But notice in verse 18, while he was still speaking, another also came and said, "Your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house. And it fell on the young people, and they died. And I alone have escaped to tell you." Now, it must be tragic to lose one child. But notice what happened here. Job in one day lost his 10 children. His 7 sons and his 3 daughters were all killed in one day. How do we react when we're faced with things like this? I mean, I can't imagine anyone facing such a severe trial as Job did, losing 10 children in one day. But when we face similar problems, family concerns, how do we react? How do we respond? And there's a third area, of course, maybe concerning our own health. How do we react when we have our own health concerns? Maybe our health is inconsistent, or maybe we have ongoing illnesses or various diseases. How do we react when things don't go quite as planned in our own lives? Well, again, let's go to Job chapter 2 and have a look at verse 7 this time. Because in Job 2 verse 7, Job himself had his own health problems. In Job 2 verse 7, Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a potsherd to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. Well, sore boils, they must have been fairly severe, because as you go on in the book of Job, he describes himself as withering away and decaying and close to death. How do we react in situations like this, when things don't go as planned, when we have economic concerns or family concerns or our own health concerns? How do we react? How do we respond when times are hard? Well, that's why I've entitled the lesson this morning, Words of Defeat and Words of Victory. I'd like you to have a look with me this morning at different reactions in situations like we've talked about this morning. And so let's begin this morning with words of defeat. And I'd like first of all to notice Job's wife. So let's go back to Job chapter 1 and notice here, Job chapter 2, and notice Job's wife's reaction to all of these things. Now, we've got a feel for Job's wife. We've got a feel for her because just as Job lost 10 children, of course, they were her children as well. She lost 10 children. And she was suffering economic and other concerns. The Sabaeans, the Chaldeans attacked and took their property. The fire burned up their property and so on. So she would have had serious concerns. But again, how do we react when things don't go as planned, when things are severe like this? Well, let's notice in Job 2 verse 9, she utters words of defeat. In Job 2 verse 9, his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." Wow, aren't they words of defeat? In other words, Job's wife saying to Job, look, it's hopeless. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. What's the point of continuing? You might as well give up your integrity, your faithfulness. You might as well curse God and just die. And aren't they words of defeat? And I wonder, do we ever feel like that? When we're faced with things that don't go as planned, when times are hard, do we ever start thinking along this line, that it's hopeless, there's no light at the end of the tunnel, what's the point of continuing? Curse God and die. Well, we shouldn't do, of course, because they are words of defeat. And I often wonder in the story of Job, what Job's wife must have thought of later on, when at the end of the book of Job, in Job chapter 42, Job's property and goods and so on are restored to him twofold, and he has another 10 children, another 7 sons and another 3 daughters. What must his wife have thought then about the words she uttered right back at the beginning of the book, curse God and die? You see, they're words of defeat. They're words that we shouldn't utter when times are hard and when times don't go as we expect. Let's have a look at the second example of words of defeat. Let's consider the sons of Israel this time. And sadly, there are many examples we could choose here, but there's only one I want to look at today, and this is in Exodus chapter 14. Let's turn to Exodus chapter 14. On this occasion, the Israelites were leaving Egypt. They were being pursued by the Egyptians, and they came up to the Red Sea, and they were in trouble. So they thought, because they had the Red Sea blocking their progress and they had the Egyptian army pursuing them from behind. So again, things weren't going to plan. Things were hard for them here. And what did they do? Well, they uttered words of defeat. Let's have a look at Exodus 14 at verse 11. They said to Moses, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in this wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is it not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone, so that we might serve the Egyptians'? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." Wow, aren't they words of defeat? Can you see what they're saying? We've had it. We've got no chance of winning or succeeding in this battle. We can't do anything. We've got the sea in front of us and the Egyptians behind us. You're going to let us die in this wilderness. And again, I wonder if we ever feel like that. Do we ever get so down because things are not going our way that we start to think like the sons of Israel did on this occasion? They're words of defeat, aren't they? And what we need to remember is that shortly after this, God through Moses was able to part the Red Sea. and they were able to cross over, and the Egyptians were drowned in the Red Sea. You see, we should never utter these words of defeat, even when things are not going our way, because with God all things are possible. As I said, there are many examples, unfortunately, with the sons of Israel that we could look at. A little time later, when they tried to enter the Promised Land, 10 spies came back and brought an evil report that they couldn't do it. The inhabitants were too strong for them. You see, words of defeat again. It was only Caleb and Joshua who stood up and said, we can do it with God's help. Let's have a look at a third example this morning of words of defeat. Let's have a look this time at the one-talent man in the parable that Jesus presented. Let's turn to Matthew 25 this time. Here again we find words of defeat. Now, Jesus told this parable, of course, about a man who was going on a journey and he entrusted his possession to his own slaves. Eventually he comes back and requires a reckoning. And notice the words of defeat here in Matthew 25 verse 24. The one who had received the 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you do not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid and went and hid your talent in the ground. See, have what is yours. Well, there are words of defeat. The master had left him with the talent to go and work with that talent. And what does he say to him? I was too scared. It was too hard for me to do anything with it. I just want to do things my way. I just want to go and bury that talent in the ground and do nothing with it. Words of defeat, you see. Instead of listening to his master and doing what his master said, he utters these words of defeat. And what's interesting about that parable is that Jesus also mentions here 2 other servants who were entrusted with much more, 2 talents and 5 talents, and they were able to get on with the job, and they were able to make another 2 talents, another 5 talents. But you see, this 1 talent man uttered words of defeat. He wanted to do it his own way. He didn't want to serve the master. He wanted to bury the talent. And then when the master comes back, he says, I was too scared, too afraid. And as we go on in the parable, if we go down to verse 26, Jesus says to him, you wicked, or says about him, you wicked, lazy slave. The master says to him, you wicked and lazy slave. You see, these are words of defeat. They're uttered by wicked and lazy people who don't want to get on with serving God. And even when things don't go our way and don't go as expected, we shouldn't be uttering words like these. The final example on words of defeat, of course, Felix is a good example. Governor Felix. Let's turn to Acts 24. Here Felix was feeling a bit of pressure from the Apostle Paul. Paul was preaching the gospel to him, and you can imagine him tugging at the collar of his shirt, feeling the pressure building. But have a look here in Acts 24 verse 24. Some days later Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess, and sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. So here's Paul preaching the gospel. But as he was discussing righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come, all good topics in preaching the gospel, of course, Felix became frightened and said, now listen to these words of defeat, go away for the present, and when I find time, I'll summon you. Words of defeat. There was a man who was feeling the pressure, you see, and basically says, go away. Now's not the time. I haven't got time for this now. Not now. Sometime later, maybe. As far as we know from the record, there was no time later for Felix. But that's what he was saying. And notice here that procrastination are words of defeat. People are saying things and not doing anything about it, not doing anything about the gospel, but putting it off. Procrastination are words of defeat. Now is the day of salvation, 2 Corinthians 6 verse 2. Now is the time to act. We don't have tomorrow. We might do, but we can't be sure of it. Don't boast about tomorrow, Proverbs 27 verse 1. There's that saying, of course, I'm sure you've all heard, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And what that means is that people who have good intentions but don't put them into practice, of course, end up being punished in the end. And so we've got to make sure that we don't utter words of defeat like Felix did. Not now. I haven't got time for this now. I'm scared. Maybe we felt like this on our own at times. Want to put things off. What was the old saying that I heard as a youngster? Don't do today what you can put off till tomorrow. Well, that might be fine for some things, but certainly not for the gospel. Do today what you have the opportunity today, because today is the only time we are assured of having. Well, we have many examples, of course, of words of defeat. These are only a few from the scriptures, but people, when they were faced with certain circumstances, things were not going as planned, maybe things were hard, we find them uttering these words of defeat. Job's wife, the sons of Israel, the one-talent man, and Felix. Let's finish this morning by having a look at a few of the examples of the words of victory that we find in the scriptures. And let's go back to the book of Job, because although Job's wife uttered words of defeat, Job, of course, uttered magnificent words of victory. So let's go back to Job 1. Now remember, Job had severe woes at this time. Economic woes, he'd lost his possessions, family woes, his 10 children had been killed, health woes, he was very ill with sore boils, exceedingly ill. So he had his very severe woes, and yet notice these words of victory that he uttered. Let's go to Job chapter 1 verse 20. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. Now, Job wasn't a hard man who wasn't grieving. He was certainly grieving. He tore his robe, he shaved his head, he fell to the ground, and so on. He was certainly grieving. But notice what he didn't do. He didn't go out and curse the Sabaeans. He didn't go out and curse the Chaldeans. He didn't go out and curse God. He didn't sin. He concentrated his attention on God. God has given and God has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Aren't they words of victory? Words of victory uttered by Job. And in the next chapter, when we saw the words of defeat that his wife had uttered in verse 9, notice Job's words of victory in verse 10. He said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Notice he deals gently with his wife. He doesn't say, you are a foolish woman. He says, you speak as one of the foolish women. Gently correcting his wife. And notice what he goes on to say. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. In times of woe, you see, let's serve God. In times of good, let's serve God. And these were Job's words of victory. Serve God all the time, no matter what might befall us. And when we reach times of trouble and things don't go as we expect, whether it be economic concerns or family concerns or our own health concerns, let's remember Job. And let's elevate our faith to the faith of Job instead of lowering our view of God and hearing words of defeat like curse God and die. This is the example for us all, no matter what may come our way. Let's go on and consider a second example, King Hezekiah. King Hezekiah. Again, there are many examples we could look at for words of victory, but this time let's go to 2 Kings chapter 19. 2 Kings chapter 19. Now the context here is that King Hezekiah was besieged in Jerusalem. He was facing threats from the then mighty Assyrian army. The Assyrians had basically conquered the world at that time. They'd certainly conquered Israel. They'd taken the northern tribes into captivity. They'd conquered all the cities of the southern tribe of Judah, and now it was just Jerusalem besieged by the Assyrians. And again, when times are hard, when times are tough, some would offer words of defeat, but Hezekiah offers marvellous words of victory. Because what he does here is recorded for us in 2 Kings 19 verse 15. Hezekiah prayed before the Lord. Now listen to these words of victory. He said, O Lord, the God of Israel, who are enthroned above the cherubim, you are God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see. and listen to the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to reproach the living God. Truly, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have devastated the nations and their lands. He acknowledged the power of the Assyrians. It was obvious to all that they were the world power of the time. Verse 18, and they have cast their gods into the fire, for they were no gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. So they have destroyed them. Now, O Lord our God, I pray, deliver us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth shall know that you alone, O Lord, are God. Wow. Now, aren't they magnificent words of victory? You're the last city standing, and you're surrounded by this mighty nation that's conquered all the world, even your northern neighbours. And he goes and utters these words of victory to God. Yes, God, they are powerful, but they worship gods who are no gods. And they've conquered lands of gods that are no gods. You are our God, deliver us. And we're not going to read on here, but you know the story, I hope. The Assyrians, 185,000 are killed in one night, and of course they retreat quickly because they realise that this city has the real and living God working for them. When times are good, you see, serve God. When times are not good, when we're in trouble, keep serving God. Utter words like these, words of victory. Hezekiah prayed to God, we should pray without ceasing. 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 17. Words of victory. Well, let's keep going. We had a look at Job's wife, uttered words of defeat. Let's have a look at another woman this time, Queen Esther, who uttered words of victory. Let's turn to the book of Esther. Again, we're not going to read the context here, but you're probably familiar with the story. The Jews were being threatened at this time. The king of Persia was on the throne. And if we go to Esther chapter 4, the king of Persia had a rule in place at this time that if anyone came into his presence without his request, they would usually be put to death. And Esther on this occasion needs to petition on behalf of her people, the Jews. And so she decides to go in and see the king, and of course this could mean instant death for her if the king doesn't accept her. But notice her words of victory here. Esther chapter 4 verse 15. Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat bread or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. Wow, what a great example of faith, of words of victory there. You can see what Esther was doing here. She was relying on God. She says, I'm going to fast and my maidens are going to fast for 3 days. Now, fasting doesn't just mean, of course, you don't eat or drink. Fasting in the Old Testament was always associated with praying to God, putting petitions before God. So she would fast and be praying to God with her maidens for 3 days. She encouraged others, Jews, to do the same. She told Mordecai to go and tell the other Jews in Susa to do the same thing. Fast and pray to God. Great faith and trust in God, you see, words of victory. And then she said, I'll go in and see the king at great risk. I might perish, but I'll still go in and see him. Words of victory, words of faith. And you know the story, I'm sure. She went in to see the king, he accepted her, and eventually the plot to destroy the Jews was overthrown, and things went well with the Jews. Words of victory rather than words of defeat. No matter what circumstances we're in, good or bad, we should be uttering and thinking about words of victory rather than words of defeat. Last one this morning I'd like us to think about is the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul. Let's turn to Philippians chapter 4. Now you'll remember that Paul faced severe persecution for the cause of Christ. A lot of people in this world don't like the gospel of Christ, don't like to hear about it, and like to punish and persecute those who promote it. We're not going to turn there now, but in 2 Corinthians 11 verses 22 to 33, verse after verse after verse, he lists the troubles that he faced for the cause of Christ. Imprisoned so many times, beaten with rods, whipped, all of these kinds of things he lists there. So he was suffering because he was serving Christ. And even here in Philippians chapter 4, when we read Paul's letter here, you remember that he was in prison at this stage for the gospel of Christ. So even now, he was still being persecuted and imprisoned. Now, Paul, you see, wasn't like the people that we've looked about. The sons of Israel, for example. He didn't say, well, I can't do anything. I'm trapped. He wasn't like the one-talent man who cried out, I was too scared to do anything. Even though he's being persecuted and he was in prison, look at these words in Philippians 4 verse 13. Philippians 4 verse 13, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Wow, what words of victory. I can do, even though I'm in prison, even though I'm suffering for the gospel, I can still do all things through him who strengthens me. And Paul was doing that, wasn't he? He was writing this letter to the Philippians. He was preaching the gospel even while imprisoned, and Caesar's household became acquainted with the gospel, we're told elsewhere in Philippians. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. These weren't the only words of victory that Paul uttered, of course. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians 15. In 1 Corinthians 15 verse 57, thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your toil is not in vain in the Lord. More words of victory, and there are many, many more, of course, that we could look at this morning. So again this morning, let's go back to where we started. Words of defeat or words of victory. How do you react when things are getting hard, when things are not going the way they should? It might be economic troubles. It might be family troubles or concerns. It might even be your own health concerns. How do you react in those situations? Do you come up with words of defeat? Like Job's wife did, curse God and die. Or the sons of Israel, we've had it. Or the one-talent man, I was too scared, so I just buried what I should have been using. Or Felix, who said, no, not now, maybe later. Words of defeat. Let's not respond with words of defeat. Let's instead, no matter what comes our way, as hard as it might be, let's respond with words of victory, like Job himself did. Severe economic, family, and personal concerns, and yet he was able to utter those marvellous words of victory. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord. King Hezekiah, seemingly hopeless position, uttered words of victory, praying to God for deliverance. Queen Esther, prepared to sacrifice her own life, just like Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego in Daniel chapter 3. They said, "O king, we're not going to worship your idol. God can save us from your furnace, but even if he doesn't, we're still not going to worship your idol." You see, these are words of victory. And even if people die in the situation, they are words of victory and they'll be rewarded for eternity. And of course, the Apostle Paul, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. The many, many examples that we could have looked at this morning, we don't have time for, but the issue right here and now is which way are we going to react to difficult times? Are we going to utter words of defeat or words of victory? I'd like us to finish in Hebrews chapter 10, because here's the way that we should be responding to all of these things. In Hebrews chapter 10 verse 35, Hebrews 10 verse 35, therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you've done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. There's the guidance for us. Just keep on keeping on. Endure. Not just doing whatever we want to do, but doing the will of God. Keep enduring, doing the will of God. And if we skip down to verse 39, we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. Continue on in faith. Utter words of victory, not words of defeat, no matter what circumstances might come our way. Words of defeat, words of victory. Let's think very carefully about how we're going to live our lives. Before we do finish up this morning, it would be wrong of me to stop without extending the invitation to any who might be listening this morning or watching this lesson. For any who haven't yet become Christians, to believe in Jesus, to be repentant and to be baptised for forgiveness of sins. Acts 2 verses 36 to 38. Don't procrastinate like Felix did. Don't say not now but later. Act now and become a Christian. Remember, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We've got to act and not just say sometime later. If you're here this morning or listening to this lesson and you're erring as a Christian, you once were a Christian but you've fallen away, then Acts chapter 8 verse 22, repent and pray for forgiveness. Don't be lazy like the one-talent man who went and buried his talent and tried to get away with it, the master, saying, look, I was too scared so I did it my way. Well, no. Let's listen to the master, let's repent and pray. Remember, now is the day of salvation. And for those of us who are here this morning or listening to this, who are already Christians, already being faithful, let's remember the words of Paul and Barnabas in Acts 14, 21 and 22. He urged the disciples to continue on in the faith, saying, through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. Let's keep on faithful. Let's say like Paul did, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Words of victory, words of defeat. Let's think carefully about these now as we sing the last song.